Welcome to the next in our series of lectures for Western Civ 1. Today we are going to be shifting our focus to ancient Greece. As always, there are some things I'd like you to watch for in this video. There are a couple of things from the map I'd like you to be able to identify, some terms I'd like you to be able to explain, as well as some questions that you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is over. So, let's get to it. Before we talk about the ancient Greeks, let's do a little bit of a review. What have we learned so far? Well, first of all, we know that civilization dates to about 7000 BCE, give or take a few thousand years. We know that the Sumerians were the people who gave us writing. We know that the Hebrews were the people that gave us monotheism, among other things. We also know that the Persians gave us culturally diverse societies. So what about Greece? In fact, Greek culture is going to have a major impact on the culture of Western civilization. Greek poetry is still read today. Greek plays are still performed. Greek philosophers continue to influence modern thought. And anyone who's been to Washington, D.C. can tell that Greek architecture is alive and well. Finally, those of us who live in democratic societies can thank the Greeks as well. In fact, the word democracy means the rule of the people, and it comes from the ancient Greeks. That's a pretty amazing resume for one tiny peninsula on the southeastern edge of Europe. Greek culture and civilization were both heavily influenced by geography. Just as the Fertile Crescent shaped life in Mesopotamia, Greece's long coastline and poor soil had a major impact on its culture as well. That long coastline meant that the Greeks were never far from the sea. Thus they were very comfortable with sea travel, sending out trading ships and colonists across the Mediterranean. That's a good thing because, as the textbook points out, only about 20% of the land in Greece can be farmed. That meant that the Greeks had to develop trade to bring in enough food to support a growing population. At the same time, notice on the map above that Greece is really a collection of dozens of islands and narrow peninsulas. This, coupled with a series of high mountain ranges, meant that the cities of Greece developed independently from one another. Now, more on that later. Let's talk a little bit about Greek history. Let's begin by looking at Greece before the Greeks. A number of cultures called the Greek peninsula home in the thousands of years that followed the introduction of agriculture. One of the first great cultures in the area were a people known as the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were an aggressive people that quickly came to dominate the other cultures living in Greece. The peak of Mycenaean civilization in Greece came at about the years between 1400 and 1200 BCE. In other words, this is roughly the same time that the ancient Hebrews were beginning to unite in Israel. Now, as I said earlier, Greek soil was poor. Thus, to survive, the Mycenaeans had to develop extensive trading networks throughout the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. The need to dominate these trade routes meant that the Mycenaeans were also a very aggressive people. They left behind them numerous stories of their successful military campaigns and their conquests. Probably the best known of these was the Trojan War. Troy was a city, possibly even a Mycenaean colony, in what is today Turkey. Now we'll talk more about the Trojan War later on in this lecture. Unfortunately for the Mycenaeans, the Greek landscape, specifically its mountains and its many peninsulas, prevented them from uniting into a great empire like the Assyrians or the Persians. In fact, the competition for food and resources and trade meant that the Mycenaeans spent much of their time fighting among themselves. Ultimately, around the year 1100 BCE, the Mycenaean civilization simply collapsed. And with it, early Greek culture collapsed as well. And the Greek peninsula entered what historians today call the Greek Dark Age. This Dark Age coincided with the decline of Greek civilization. Remember, two key components of civilization are writing and trade. Both disappeared during this Dark Age. Well, why? Well, think about it. Mycenaean power had opened up trade routes across the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. Without that power, that trade collapsed. Mycenaean civilization had also supported scholarship and the need for writing. Without that civilization, there was no one to pass on the ability to write from one generation to the next. Remember this. Every time a great empire or culture vanishes, it will often take civilization with it. But that's not the end of it. Think of a declining civilization sort of like a rock rolling downhill. It just keeps picking up speed as it moves along. That's sort of what happens in Greece. The decline of Mycenaean civilization led to a collapse of food production. Remember, Greek soil is bad, and therefore they had to rely on trade to feed themselves. The collapse of trade led to a decline in food production. As life became almost unlivable in Greece, many people simply left, leaving the Greek peninsula for new lands. In fact, when you factor in migration with the starvation caused by the collapse of trade, it is possible that Greece lost up to 90% of its population following the Mycenaean collapse. Let's put that into some perspective. The U.S. right now has a population of about 313 million. If we lost 90% of our population, that would be a loss of 281.7 million people. If that happened, our economy, our government, and our culture would be in serious danger of completely disappearing. That's the situation faced by those left on the Greek peninsula after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. If that kind of a disaster happened here, it also would probably lead the survivors to remember, quote, the good old days, end quote, as a golden age. Now that's exactly what happened in Greece. During the Dark Age, tales of the Mycenaean power and nobility became popular. Most of those stories were spread by word of mouth. Remember, Greece had lost the ability to read and write. Instead, storytellers, oral storytellers, would travel from town to town, entertaining crowds with stories about the heroes of the Trojan War. These stories later became the basis for the great poet Homer and his epic poetry. Those poems are, of course, the Iliad, which tells the story of Mycenaean conquest of the city of Troy, and the Odyssey, which is sort of the sequel to the Iliad, because it tells the story of Odysseus, one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and his attempt to return to Greece after the war is finally over. As your textbook points out, these stories are not histories. They include stories about gods and goddesses and talk of magic and people who may or may not have existed. So in other words, we can't rely on Homer to provide us with a history of the Trojan War. But Homer's poems are still valuable to scholars today because they tell us a great deal about the things that the Greeks of Homer's age valued. These values include military power, honor, and glory. And as your textbook points out, these were the traits that Homer believed were in short supply during the Dark Ages in which he lived. Ultimately, Greece will emerge from the Dark Ages. Typically, this is a period known as the Archaic period, and it lasted roughly from 750 to 500 BCE. Again, just to put this into perspective, this is roughly the time that the Assyrians were rampaging across Mesopotamia, conquering the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. It's time when the Babylonians swept in and conquered Judah and carried off the Hebrews into captivity in Babylon. So this is all happening at roughly that same time. At the center of this revival was something known as the polis. Now, the polis is one of the most important concepts you need to understand if you are going to understand the history and the culture of ancient Greece. In one sense, a polis is simply the Greek word for city. However, it really is much more than that. Think of the polis as a community in every sense of the word. A community is a collection of people who often share a city or a region. Those people share more than simply land, however. They also share an identity and a culture. The polis will provide protection for its members. It provides order and support for its members as well. However, to be a citizen of a polis meant that one also had responsibilities to that polis. Citizens had an obligation to participate in government. They had an obligation to serve in the military to protect the polis. In short, to be a member of a polis meant contributing your very life to the survival of that polis. As the great Greek philosopher Aristotle put it, we must rather regard every citizen as belonging to the state. That shows you basically that, yeah, you were a citizen of that polis, but in doing so you actually belonged to that community. That's an important thing to understand and to remember. We also need to understand that the polis had a dark side as well. Like the Mycenaeans, the Greeks never united their various cities or polis into a unified empire. Part of that was due to geography, mountains, the peninsulas, etc. However, it was also due to the fact that while a polis inspired great loyalty in its members, that loyalty did not extend to Greece itself. Residents of one polis had no love or loyalty for residents of another polis. This served to fracture Greece into dozens of small, independent regions that neither trusted nor liked one another. Another dark side of the polis was social division. Not everyone who lived in a polis belonged to that polis. In fact, citizenship was reserved for only a tiny minority. First, the rights of citizenship in a Greek polis were restricted just to adult male citizens. Women had no say in most Greek cities. We will see that there is an exception to that. But really, for the most part, women had no say in most Greek cities. Second, most polis had large slave populations. Thus, while the Greeks were the ones to introduce the world to democracy, that democracy was only limited to a small fraction of the population. A final element of the revival of Greek culture was colonization. As Greece's population recovered from the Dark Ages, the polis began to send out parties of colonists into the Mediterranean. These colonists were often in search of new lands to farm. Remember, Greek soil is poor, and so therefore the colonists wanted to find new lands to provide more food for the people living back in Greece. As the population began to grow once again, it was important that the polis find new sources of food and resources for the people back home. You can see the extent of those colonies on the map above. The purple areas are places colonized by the Greeks. You can see that it extends all the way from the Black Sea in what is now Russia to Eastern Europe to Turkey to Northern Africa. Now, these colonies maintained close ties with Greece through trade, etc. Thus, colonization meant that the culture of ancient Greece was not restricted just to the Greek peninsula, but it spread throughout the entire Mediterranean. And as I said here, even as far north as the Black Sea. Now, that's it for this lecture. Now we're going to look a little more closely at a couple of the polis that made Greece such a powerful and influential force in the ancient world.